Hello everyone, in this video I want to show you how I made this illustration by Francisco Fonseca as a pixelated version using Photoshop. Hello, this is a little different from what I usually do. This time I'm doing someone else's work in pixelart version. This is Francisco Fonseca's work. He's a Portuguese illustrator and painter. He does these amazing house illustrations of like old houses, very typical of Portugal. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to try and see if I can capture his style in pixel art, given that I have way less resolution. So a few things that I want to point out about Francisco's work. We can look at the process, which is not too different from what people usually do in other forms of media, right? He starts with a line base. I think these are done for the most part without an underlaying sketch, but I think it actually helps give the building that sort of wonky character it has. And then I think I've also seen other watercolor artists do this, which is to provide an immediate shadow pass on top of the outlines or the line drawing. So there's an immediate register, or you basically put down shadow information in a drawing. This is great because it acts as a guide for you to work from then on. Now, the way that this works in watercolor is that basically it's like a multiply layer in Photoshop. So I'm not sure if I'm going to do that in my version, but it would be interesting to try something similar. Then it's an issue of adding color. And one of the main characteristics here is because I think both Francisco and other watercolor artists have to constantly remix color. So you'll end up with these wonderful different hues of all of the colors that you want to use. So your yellow is never going to be a flat yellow unless you use it straight out of the tube, which is not very common, because even if you use it from the little sort of block of color that usually comes with those watercolor sort of palettes, by going with your brush over to other colors and then coming back to that one, you will eventually tint that color that you wanted before. So you're going to end up with these amazing hue variations anyway. The other thing about the shadow is because the shadow actually dries a little bit lighter, you can see here at the bottom that the blue is already a lot lighter than the one that has just been painted recently and looks extremely dark. It doesn't end up like that, and ends up like this. And then the end result adds way more detail. And one of the things that I find fun is that Francisco will later on add these sort of vertical lines. Now, as you can see already, these are 1 pixel wide with 1 pixel gap. And I'm not going to be painting an image that is, what is this? This is 300 pixels wide. I'm not going to do that. I was hoping to do something very similar. So I'm going to look for the smallest detail that I can still sort of make out as a detail. So for example, this little really tiny chimney, this measures 8 pixels wide. I would love for this to be like maybe 3 pixels wide. So this would have to be half of the size it is right now, but that's still pretty big. So I'm going to go 2 pixels wide, and this is being 8. This image is actually going to have to be resized to about a quarter of the size it has right now. So I'll scale it down to 25% and we'll see what we have. So I'll go into my sort of image size. So currently the image is 800 pixels wide. This is the whole canvas. And instead of doing math by figuring out how much, I'll just go into pixels, change that to percent, and say that I want a 25% by 25% scale. This will shrink this whole canvas down to a quarter of its size, and the image will follow. And let's have a look at what that looks like. Okay, so that's actually smaller than I thought. So I think I'm not going to go all the way down, because then I don't have details for the little bits here at the top. I'm actually going to scale this down to, let's say, in terms of percent, instead of 25, let's say 30, 33, which is a third. And that's more manageable. Okay, so the steps I'm going to take, I'm going to go use it through the same steps as Francisco does. The thing is, there's already something that is going to be a difficult issue to deal with. So let's make a new layer here, which is the fact that the houses have quite peculiar angles. Now, this is really fun in the style that Francisco is working, but in pixel art, it's really annoying when you go out of angle, right? So for example, here on the vertical bars of the house, it's quite a small angle. So it's like a 1-2 degrees, maybe even less, which means that your pixel art line is not going to be perfectly straight. There's going to be a slight kink in it, right? And that is, at least to me, slightly annoying. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't do it. Of course you can. But I think it would be more interesting to justify those kinks by having some form of like architectural detail. So for example, on this edge here, actually that one is not too bad, but on this one, either I do it like perfectly vertical and then figure out some way to play with the light, or I would do it slightly angled, but then look at all of these moments where the line breaks and find some justification. So for example, if you go back to this side, what we can do, and if you could remove this layer, we can see that there's a moment here where that happens. There's a moment here where that happens. So what I could do is I could actually just bring that break over there. Let's change my eraser also to a pixelated brush. Let's go for my smaller brush. And then what we could do is say that this is like a brick on the wall or a crack on the wall, right? And the same thing down here. We can actually even save the widening for a later stage in the image to sort of help with the idea that this is actually on purpose. So if you put a white layer underneath, you can see that the line now has that effect, right? It's not what I want to do. I maybe want the white layer, but I wanted it 50% transparency. So let's very quickly go over and outline the whole sketch and see what we have, okay? So I'll speed through this. All right, so this is as far as I'll go with the line work for now. I feel like if I added more lines, it would just make the drawing busier. So I'm actually going to start by adding the shadow layer and see if that helps in sort of separating the surfaces of the drawing for me, which will probably help me not have to add so many lines, because pixel art lines tend to sort of take up space, and you want to eventually convert a lot of those lines into details. So I'm just going to make a new layer, pick a dark blue, and start painting away, right? And then have that change to multiply, and then we can see the effect. It's pretty much the same as what we had initially. So let's go and fix this now. Right, so this is the basis for the shadow layer, and it's already really helpful because I have a pretty decent idea of the lines that I want to keep and the lines that I don't even need. So for example, here on the entryway, this vertical line here, which belongs in the drawing, it exists in the drawing, because the surface is now so distinct. I probably don't need that line, or I can convert that line into something else, maybe not as intense, not as a black line. So yeah, this is really good and helpful for defining shape. Now, the other thing I want to do is I basically want to steal Francisco's palette, because these are really nice colors, and I'm just going to color pick them using a eyedropper, and I'm just going to lay them off into a new layer right here. Actually, I just might put it on top of the black area. So we have this tan color for most of the wall, and I'm actually going to draw that in sort of a size which is a reference to the percentage it takes up. So for example, also this sort of clay color for the roof tiles, I'm going to add them in a sort like a percentage kind of feel. I just want to get the light tone, which is this one. And there's like this other different tan color, which you can hardly see it, but it's slightly more desaturated. And then I think this one, yeah, it's probably pretty close to the same. So I figure I could do the roof in just like these three colors, but it feels like there's way more in the drawing. Like for example, this dark desaturated color, right? So for the tan, we have that blue. We have this kind of like caramel color, not blue, sorry, yellow. We have this bird like banana yellow, again with a little light, and there's a bit of green here. Actually, there's way more green at the bottom. But just having all of these different hues is really helpful to then just go in and like pick from here to paint, right? Then we have the shutters colors, which is like, I guess these two, this and the bright version of it. And I'm not going to worry too much about the frames because I know that they're white, so I'll just wait for the colors to be put into the drawing so that I know what white would look like in that setting, because it would be it would be influenced by it. So there's also a little bit more clay at the bottom, which is really clever because what happens is as the Adobe flakes off, you get to see either the clay bricks or you get to see the clay underlaying in the building. So it actually works really well. It's an interesting way of doing it. And I think these are pretty much the colors that I want to use for now. Okay, so we're going to go back to our line drawing, and I'm going to I'm going to deactivate. Actually, I do want the white background. I just don't want it over my color palette, so I'm just going to delete the excess. Right. This is an odd format to work in a horizontal screen. Right, so I have my colors. I have the line and the shadow. So I'm actually going to go into the line layer and do a selection of all of the outline of the outside of the building. And once I have that selection, I can make a new layer underneath it and flood fill it in with the color that I think is the most common, which is going to be some form of maybe this yellow here, or maybe this one. So that's the basis for the house's color, right? Now I'm going to lock the transparency in there, and I'm going to start painting. As far as what I remember, I also have an additional reference on another screen. So if you feel betrayed by me like knowing these colors by heart, I don't. I actually have a reference. So I'll just push on painting this. I'm going to do them in this sort of brush strokey kind of manner because I think that'll work better for now. And then as we get closer to what the image is going to look like in the end, then I can come in and be more careful with the type of either brush strokes or types of color areas that I use. Also, it's kind of funny to see what happens when, let's see, we'll take this color all the way under, and you can see the greens start to pop up, same as you had with the house, where there's a bit more tints of green in there, right? That's kind of what I'm going for, is just let the shadow layer do its work, and we can have a poke at what that looks like. There's a color that I think I didn't color pick, which is this one. So I'll just add that to my palette there and see what that looks like. It's pretty close to that, so actually not too much of a big deal. So we'll just add that to the top, and yeah, let's paint this out. The one technique I usually use is when I want to get rid of stray colors inside of certain patches, I'll just do a selection and paint over them. For example, in this case, I don't want this color to be here, and it might happen in other places like this single pixel here. So what I'll do is just color select that color with contiguous off, right? And then, ooh, that's a different color. And then color pick the color I want and just like paint over that area. So I get rid of that noisy effect, which I might want in some other places. For example, this dark spot here, I don't want it there. So I'll just look for the neighboring color that I want to use, and I'll have that. I'll still have the noise, but just not as deep and as intense. And yeah, so that's the trick. Let's press on. Right, so now we're at a phase where the colors are already there and they kind of fit with the general vibe of the image. And again, as I predicted, it's kind of fun to see what happens when you start painting stuff in the shades, because you get to see sort of the shadow layer come in and do its work and create the hues that I didn't even put in the palette. It just makes them out of the fact that these are being affected by the shadow, but also the white for the so for the AC for the shutters, I changed that to a slight a darker tint of actually light tint of gray, which I actually picked from the side there. And it's now getting to the point where the line work is actually a hindrance, where it's actually breaking the illusion of an illustration. So if I take the line work away, it just becomes way more painterly, way more interesting. And that's because the way that the line work is working on the image is that it's flat black, which is not going to be what happens when you sort of pull out of an illustration. The fact that you're zooming away makes the sort of the lines already in the drawing kind of lose its strength. So one easy trick was just to lower the opacity of the lines. This is 50%, this is 30%. They're still there. They still do their job of like establishing margins, as you can see here. But to me, I think it would work way better if instead of doing that, I would actually work the margins within the the texture for the background. I was quite surprised how much the graffiti actually added to the image. So I'm just going to get my 1 pixel brush, which I should definitely move. And I'll start adding, and you can see the effect. So these are this is the line work. I'm going to put it bracket 100%. I'm just going to do some texture work there, which is something that is similar to what exists in the original drawing. So there's a few sort of places where the color flaked off, and I'm sort of like picking on that, or I'm using that as a way to sort of create colors that sit next to that border, basically. Lines don't really exist in the real world except for actual lines like power lines and wires and stuff like that. So whenever you define a line in a drawing, it's a shorthand for a color frontier. So basically a change of color, a change of hue, a change of intensity in something. And so you can just recreate those lines by having those color borders exist again. So for example, if now for the front of this, I use something like this lighter tan color, which not only is in the palette, I think actually is what's happening in this part of the image. Actually, there's a step here. There's a little thicker bottom bit, and then there's a little bit of a shadow at the bottom. It would be easier for me to really show that just by not having the outline. And I can actually now go in and do a little bit more pushing in and just get that sort of color border to really exist close to the place where it's supposed to be. So that could be pushed in a little bit. And now I'm left with this. There's a part here that I haven't figured out yet, which is the actual thickness of these parts. So for example, in the original drawing, this was like a frame, but then I would have to have the thickness of the frame, because then it opens up to this sort of entryway. And you can see that in the original. Let's see if we can see it in the original line drawing. No, it's gone. Yeah, in the original drawing as well. But I can probably pull in the actual image so we can see. Let me just double click that. Yeah, you can probably see that over. Yeah, there you go. So this bit, right? There's a thickness there that I still have not defined. Now, this thickness, we perceive it as thickness because Francisco did a very clever thing, which is he did the hatching in perspective. Now that conveys a different hue and shadow, but it also conveys direction of the surface. That's something that really helps when someone has to interpret your drawings. So in that sense, it's actually really good that we have access to that, but it's going to make my life a little bit harder. But I think what is going to happen now is that I'm at the stage of detail. The other big hurdle is also the roof. Now, the roof in Francisco's drawing has every individual tile illustrated, right? Because it's done with pencil, it's laborious, and it takes time, but it's actually doable. In pixel art, I can't just go in, let's do it on a different layer, and just like do that for every tile, right? Because the moment I come in with a second line of tiles, or the moment I come in with a vertical separators of each tile, they're gone, right? There's nothing, there's no reference of what this might be. And so the best solution here would be to find a stylized way of seeing that. And one thing I can try is I can bring back the original image in Photoshop. I can look at the ceiling, or sorry, the roof, and figure out what it is that it's important about it. And one of the things I think is important about it is, of course, the direction, the sort of the direction of the texture, and then the fact that these are rectangles and that they sort of lay down in this sort of matrix kind of feel. The other thing I like to do is like bring up threshold. Threshold is one of my favorite filters now. If you see it, if I pull it all the way down, you can see that there's some tiles that pop up first to the left, right? And that's kind of the texture that I should have. Now, if I keep going, you can kind of see a very clear, distinct texture. Now, again, this original image that I screenshotted is actually higher resolution than the resolution I'm working in, so it might not be possible to do, but I'm not losing hope. And then as if I keep pushing, you get less of the texture. You get just a suggestion of the texture here, and then you get a little bit more texture. So this is a really good indicator that there's a difference in shadow and light. So what would happen though if I use something like a high pass filter? The high pass filter, especially if I go for lower values, let's say 20, is going to ruin that in a way because it's going to sort of flatten it out. So now, when I do the threshold, all the tiles kind of show up at the same time and they all sort of blow out at the same time as well. Also, the paper now has its own sort of texture. It's a really interesting look. I'm not going to lie. It actually makes the drawing look like it was done with like ink. The whole thing was done in ink, so it's an interesting look. But I'm mostly focused on getting the texture out of the roof. So the high pass kind of works for some bits, might not be the best solution here for the roof. I know it's not too different. You probably go like, doable. But it's always interesting to sort of look and explore. So what I was thinking of doing is just going in, we'll try this on this area of the roof, right? So we'll do this method, which is one of my favorites. I'll just start with my single pixel brush. I'll make it just a tad bigger because it just needed to be, there you go. And now I'm going to start with a darker tone, right? And I'll do like a little selection here just to make sure that I have this bit selected. And I'll do this and I'll flood fill that area. And then I'll just go over to the margins. Now, what's the next color that I have following that? So I'm doing the dark color. There's this dark tone, which is pretty similar. And then there's this, which is a huge step. I'm going to do a halfway between. So I'm going to take the light tone right here, and I'm going to go into 50% opacity. And then I'm going to go back to 100% opacity. I'll color pick this. So this is an in-between of those two colors, right? And with this, I'm not really going to paint. Actually, let's save that color here on my palette. Why can't I? Oh, what's happening? Is something wrong? Oh, it's in the wrong layer. Of course. Right, okay, there we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by defining a lighter area, right? So I know that it should be lighter at the top where the sun is hitting the ridge of the roofs, and then I'm going to just draw lines. I'm actually going to use my variable width pixel brush that you can actually see how I made this. There's another video where I show how I made this. And just draw vertical lines and increase the thickness in the areas that I want to suggest that the roof is actually lighter. So that's all I'm doing. I'm just doing vertical lines. Probably needs to be a little bit lighter here near the tip because it is supposed to be it's supposed to be facing up a little bit more. So I can actually go in and maybe add a little bit more darker areas here. Yeah, and let's do the same over on this side. I'm actually going to trust my brush now quite a bit, that it won't sort of spill out. I'm also trying to be careful not to go over the shadow colors and sort of get confused by them. I'll take this mid-tone now, again, paint the top, and then come in and sort of, let's start with them from the bottom, this one. I know that this is supposed to be the darker side, so I'm not going to make these like insanely huge. And I'm just trying to match the direction of the roof. I know that the roof is wider at the bottom than at the top, and that sort of forces me to have this tapered texture, but it's quite fine. And now I'll take the lighter color, and I'll do the same thing, except just within these areas, right? and that's going to allow me to have at least a suggestion of a variation of value. And the rule is if there's a change in form, that needs to be a change in value. Okay. So that's a little bit more 3D, at least for now. And I still have this light tone to go with. Now this light tone I'm going to go back to again. Single-sized pixel brush. And I'm going to use that for either one really bright brick, and maybe two, or for a little edge detail on one of the bricks here and there, right? So let's add another fully bright brick. And it's kind of odd that I'm just like doing a rectangle, but you have to consider that because of all the information that I have created now with the ridges, all of the rectangles that I add now are supposed to be partial cylinders, right? That just gave me that permission. So for example, if I take this color and I go up here and draw, you're not going to see that as lighting. You're going to see that as a lighter brick that just happened to be on the top of the roof. And if you take the time, you can go in and do a little bit of anti-aliasing. Just don't get yourself captured in that. Now at the bottom here, I'm going to actually take the dark tone and eat away at the bricks. And if you don't have sort of brick shape to eat away, what you can do is you can add just a little bit of lip to each of the ends, and that's going to suggest that the tiles are sort of wrapping around at the end here, and that's going to provide you with the additional suggestion. Now instead of shadow, or sorry, instead of light, we can now go in, whenever there's a highlight there, we can actually go in and add a break in between the tiles. And this is something that we should always do with the neighboring darker color. Not like, we shouldn't take this dark color and paint it here, except in one or two places for variety. We should take the neighboring darker color and use that to sort of do a little bit of a cut on the tiles. So there's a cut there, and these are supposed to be fairly in sync, so they should be like on a sort of a grid. So it's okay to actually do them, following a sort of same direction, right? So for example, that would be one here, one here maybe. There we go, and that's starting to look like something. Now it's not perfectly aligned, but that's okay because the house itself is also a little bit wonky. And as a friend of mine says, you want to preserve the wonk. You want to make sure that if your drawings have some sort of charm by being imperfect, make sure you keep that, because that's going to serve the purpose of the art direction in a way. So the other thing is, I'll just bring that over here because that part was missing. I'm going to take the brighter tone, or some of these brighter tones, and just use that, not really for shading, but more to separate this surface from the bottom one. Now I'll do vertical ridges, which are supposed to be layered tiles. And I'll do the same here, some rectangles, maybe a lighter one here, maybe a little bit there. And again, we're going through suggesting that this is a roof. I'll take this white color. Because it's a little messy, I can actually just take one line and add that there. That's going to sort of tie everything a little together, just like a rug would, in case you know that reference. And then I'm also going to use the sort of lighter bluish tones here for the shadow. And then we're definitely going to get into the actual shadow layer, which by this time, and this is a good point to do it, by this time should already be sort of blended into the illustration itself. There's still a lot of patchy bits here on the house, but I'm honestly super okay with it because I think it actually serves the purpose of making the paint all worn and patchy, even though there is supposed to be a stone column over here, which I'm adding now just by vertically dragging my pencil, or in this case the pen, to sort of create these areas that are supposed to be some like stone that is showing from the edges of the building. And it feels like this is actually not like an event of wear, but more like the actual design of the building, that they would have that edge be a stone. And because it's the same tone, then it's going to sort of feed into the idea that these are, the steps are made of stone as well. Now I should take a darker tone here on the steps to sort of cut them. That's the same color. Something like that. And whenever you have a cut like this, you can just, again, the neighboring darker color, and use that to cut the steps on the top surface here, just for the idea of continuation. Something like that, close to the ground. So yeah, so this is a pretty good stage to sort of start thinking about blending the layers, and I think that that's what I'm going to do. So this is pretty much the end of the process, and the difficulty here was getting up to this point, the point where, so to speak, the image has a set palette. It has all the shapes kind of in the correct place. And what I'm doing now is going in for details, but trying to keep as much as the sort of visual identity of the drawing, of the original drawing, but also the image that's now being created, as intact as possible. So I'm trying to put details in, but keeping the patterns, keeping the textures, and obviously I'm using the palette that already exists in the image. And there's a lot of spots here that don't have enough detail, but the shapes are there, the volumes are there. And so adding those details now is an issue of just finding the correct size of a map. So for example, in this window here, it's more important to me that I match the pattern on the original drawing than matching the scale of the details, because I don't think that the scale of the details was the actual main concern that the artist had. I think it was mostly based off of achieving a certain sort of visual profile, or sort of a visual identity for that element in particular. The front entrance to the house, this part here, was probably the one that is the most difficult for me. It's probably also the one that looks less like the original one, because I did have to take a few liberties. There's a lot of perspective, a lot of surfaces happening in the same spot. There's overlap, there's faces that are recessed into the building. And so it's very easy that in a shaded part, I get enough shade variation to really suggest sort of perspective and depth and shadows. And so for the longest time, right up until the end, I think, the image actually stays with that look. And then eventually I go in and add a little bit of dark lines. In that part there that I just painted, the bottom of the right side of the house, I always go for that trick of using a slightly darker shade of the same color, to convey that the line that we're seeing in the house, that's not paint, that's shadow being cast. So I have to maintain the texture, and I have to maintain the patterns from the lit part into the shaded part. And that way, people, when they look at this, they will sort of register that as a sort of as a way to see that that's not a different color. It's literally the shade. The other thing as well is that in a lot of these places, I try to occasionally go back into adding texture. And the reason for that is really to just sort of clear my mind and basically sort of reset the way that I'm looking at the image. If you look at the layers, you can see now like a rectangular layer with a hole in it. And that's just for me to sort of keep from looking at other parts of the image. I think the overall colors are set, positions are set. Now I'm really just tuning up the little details. There's a huge part missing here, which is the roof tiles for this area, for the entrance area. So I'm just copying the technique I used at the top. I'll create a base color, and then I'll sort of sketch in directional values to sort of imply the direction of the roof tiles. And then I'll go in and, shade them kind of in their own volume. And so, yeah, that's me just moving the little rectangle down. I also left the air conditioning. I think that's an air conditioning. And to the end, there's also some details on this whole part of the roof that I missed. And so here again, just taking that brush strokes that sort of come down in perspective and then adding a cross cut of a different color to sort of separate the tiles individually. And once I have those, I sort of playfully go in and kind of add different colors to each tile. Not only because they do have different colors in the original drawing, but also because since I already have the shading done, I can actually go in and play around with some of the colors, because people will still sort of register as those as different colors and not different lighting, so not different values. So here I was adding the darker shades inside of the house of the sort of the entryway, because it did look a little bit difficult to sort of separate the surfaces. The wires I'm adding in, the trick here is to just draw a wire and then sort of light it up where it's in front of a very bright color, and try to keep it light, a little darker at the end. And that's the final touches. The image is now complete. I do sort of play with the levels on the original one because the sheet of paper is very dark, and I match the levels to my sketch. I actually quite like how it looked. I think that the image was very challenging to do, but the end result is absolutely worth it. And it's fun to see that a lot of the texture was still able to stay around, even with this being done in pixel art. I hope you guys enjoy this, and I hope to see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.